Any factory today can make steel that would humiliate the finest sword ever carried into battle. A supermarket kitchen knife is harder, tougher, and more consistent than the blade some medieval master spent a month forging. That is not in dispute, and no honest account of old swords should pretend otherwise. So here's the part that refuses to sit still. When a trained materials scientist, armed with an electron microscope and a full theory of how metal behaves, set out to copy one specific old blade, the recipe beat him. Not for a day, for years. The blade was Wootz. You have probably seen it surface without knowing the name. A rippling, watery grain that runs the length of certain antique Middle Eastern swords, usually sold under the label Damascus steel. For centuries, those blades carried a reputation that grew taller with every retelling. They could slice a scarf drifting in the air. They could shear clean through a lesser sword. Some of that is romance, and the romance has done real damage to the truth. But underneath, it sits a genuine problem, and the problem is not that the blade was unbeatable. It wasn't. The problem is that nobody could work out how it had been made. Let me be exact about the puzzle, because this is the ground where this channel has slipped before, and where most videos on this subject quietly cheat. The mystery of Wootz is not that ancient smiths made better steel than modern mills can. They did not. Measured on the things an engineer actually tests, hardness, toughness, purity, the ability to make the same thing twice, modern steel wins every column, and it is not a close contest. The mystery lives on a different axis. It is a mystery of process and of knowledge. How did people with no concept of an atom, no periodic table, no idea what carbon even was, reliably produce an internal structure so particular that recovering it swallowed years of a modern laboratory's time? That is the question worth an hour. Everything else is packaging. Start with what Wootz actually is, because the word Damascus stitches together two completely different things that get confused constantly. The first is pattern welding. A smith takes rods of different iron, twists and hammers and folds them together, and the contrast between the strands leaves a pattern on the finished surface. Old, handsome, genuinely skilled, but it is a pattern built by stacking. That is not the subject here. True Wootz is a different animal. It begins as a small cake of crucible steel, melted inside a sealed clay pot, and the pattern is not layered into it from outside. The pattern grows out of the metal itself as it cools and is worked. The raw material came from South Asia. Smiths across southern India, in what is now Tamil Nadu, Karnataka, and the old Golconda country near Hyderabad, sealed wrought iron and a carbon source inside little crucibles and heated them until the steel melted and drank in carbon. What came out was a puck of very high carbon steel. The English word Wootz is just a worn-down version of uku, the local word for steel. Those ingots were the prize. They moved west along the Indian Ocean and the Persian Gulf. And in the workshops of Syria, they were forged into blades. That is the honest core of the name, with one correction worth making out loud. Damascus was largely the finishing house and the marketplace, though some scholars argue the region smelted steel of its own too. So it is not quite right to call it only a shop window. The point that holds is that much of the raw genius arrived from far to the east. There is even paperwork in a sense. In the 9th century, a scholar known as Al-Kindi, sometimes called the philosopher of the Arabs, wrote a whole treatise on swords for the Caliph Mu'tasim. He sorts blades by the origin and nature of their steel, he singles out the Indian ones, and he refers plainly to the Indian Ocean trade in steel ingots. A century or so later, Al-Biruni, one of the sharpest minds of the medieval world, described the crucible process in his book on minerals with enough detail that you can recognize the procedure today. And here is the quiet thing about that account. He could describe every step a person could see, and he still could not name the ingredient that actually made the pattern because it was invisible, and nobody would be able to see it for another 900 years. This eastern steel traveled further still. Some Viking Age blades stamped with the name Ulfbert turn out to have been forged from crucible steel, carried up the long river roads of what is now Russia, which means the same family of metal reached from South Asia almost to the edge of the known world. Sri Lanka belongs in the story too, and the way it came to light is worth telling. In 1996, the archaeologist Gil Ulev published a study in the journal Nature describing a line of ancient furnaces on the western slopes of the Sri Lankan hill country at a place called Samanalawewa. The furnaces all face the same direction into the monsoon wind. She built working replicas to test an idea, and the idea held. Wind striking the front wall pulled a steady draft through the furnace, hot enough to make steel, with no bellows and nobody pumping. Roughly half the metal that came out was good, high carbon steel. Scholars had assumed for years that wind was too unsteady to smelt with. It wasn't. The smiths had simply set their furnaces in exactly the right places and let the weather do the breathing. Later surveys by researchers, including Sharada Srinivasan, have kept fooling in how wide and how old this South Asian steel world really was. So the supply was real, the trade was real, and the metal reached the bladesmith as a high carbon puck. Now the hard part, what makes the pattern and why was copying it so brutal? The pattern is made of carbide. When steel holds a great deal of carbon, some of it binds with iron into a compound called cementite, which is extremely hard and extremely brittle. Left to itself, cementite tends to spread through the metal as an even web, and a web of something brittle is the last thing you want in a sword because it invites cracks. In good Wootz, the cementite does not spread evenly. It gathers into fine separate bands that thread through the blade, and when the surface is etched with a mild acid, those bands stand pale against the darker steel around them. That is the watering. It is beautiful. It is also the surface shadow of something happening deep inside the metal that the smith could see the trace of and never the cause. Here is the finding that finally cracked it open. Starting in the 1980s, the metallurgist John Verhoeven and the bladesmith Alfred Pendray spent years trying to reproduce true Wootz, and after a long run of failures, they found the missing ingredient. It was almost nothing. Trace impurities, tiny quantities of carbide-forming elements, vanadium above all, present in the original ore at a few hundredths of 1%, were quietly herding the cementite into those bands during the slow heating and cooling of the forge. Take the vanadium out, work the identical steel the identical way, and no pattern appears. Put a pinch back in, and the water returns on command. Earlier chemists had already tried the obvious suspects: silicon, sulfur, phosphorus, the impurities anyone would reach for first, and none of them produced the pattern. The answer was an element almost nobody thought to look at. Present, edit, in a quantity almost too small to call an ingredient. The first time I read that, I assumed the number was a misprint, because it seemed impossible that so little could matter so much. It was not a misprint. And it explained a detail that had always sounded like superstition. Only ore from certain Indian deposits carried the right trace of impurity. Part of the recipe was never in anyone's hands at all. It was in the ground. There is a stranger chapter, and I want to flag it carefully rather than sell it to you. In 2006, a team led by the German physicist Peter Pofler examined a genuine old Damascus blade at very high magnification and reported finding structures at the scale of billionths of a meter, including features they described as carbon nanotubes and thin wires of cementite. If that reading is correct, a blade from the 17th century contained structures that no one could see, let alone name, until the closing years of the 20th. I find the idea arresting. I also have to tell you that specialists have argued about it ever since, some doubting whether the structures are really what the paper claims, and I cannot present it to you as settled fact. The careful version is smaller and still remarkable. This steel carried a fine internal order that took the best modern instruments even to make out. Picture the workshop where the pattern is born. The smith is not melting anything here. That happened already in the crucible. He is forging the puck out toward a blade, and the whole game is heat. Go too hot, and the carbide dissolves back into the metal, and the pattern is gone for good, unrecoverable. A month of work turned ordinary. So he works low. He works inside a band of temperature so narrow he cannot measure it, only feel it, reading the color of the glow and the way the bar answers the hammer. Cycle after cycle, heat and cool, he draws the bands into being. He does not know vanadium exists. He knows that this ore worked this way, at this stubborn, low heat, gives the water. None of that is written down. It lives in his forearms, and it lived in his teacher's forearms before him. That is the first tradition. Now a second one, on the far side of Asia, where a completely different trick ran into the very same wall. Japan had bad iron. The raw metal that came out of a traditional smelter, a tall clay furnace called a tatara, was uneven stuff. Some of it rich in carbon, and some of it starved, riddled with slag. It was smelted from iron sand rather than rich ore. A modern mill would throw it out. The Japanese smith could not throw it out because it was all he had, so the entire craft became a long argument with lousy material. This is where the most repeated myth needs correcting. The folding of the steel, the layers that everyone loves to quote, was not done to summon magic strength. And the fantasy of a blade folded 1,000,000 times is exactly that, a fantasy. Folding was housekeeping. Hammering the billet flat and folding it back, squeezed out slag, and spread the carbon more evenly through a fundamentally messy metal. It was a cure for a supply problem. It was not a spell, and the modern marketing that calls such blades indestructible is selling, not explaining. The real brilliance came at the quench, and it earns a slow look. Steel does a strange thing when you heat it and then cool it. Cool it fast, and it locks into a hard, brittle form called martensite, superb for a cutting edge and hopeless for a spine because it snaps. Cool it slowly, and it settles into a softer, springier form called pearlite, which bends instead of breaking but will not keep a keen edge. The smith wanted both in one blade in different places along it. So before the final heating, he painted the blade with clay, thin along the cutting edge and thick down the back, then into the water. The bare edge cooled almost instantly and hardened into martensite. The clay-covered spine cooled slowly and stayed soft and tough. One quench, two different steels, split along a line the smith had drawn with his own hand. You can see that line. It is the hamon, the cloudy border that wanders down a real Japanese blade, and it is not decoration brushed on afterward. It is the actual frontier between the hard steel and the soft steel, brought out by polishing. The famous curve comes from the same instant. As the edge hardens, it expands slightly against the spine that refuses to, and the blade bends itself into shape as it cools. The smith stood at his forge, steering a change in the very arrangement of the atoms, choosing where in a single bar the metal would lock one way and where it would lock another. Several centuries before science had the words martensite and pearlite for what his hands were already deciding. I should be fair to modern steel again, because that fairness is the whole spine of this. A production blade made today from a clean, consistent alloy will outcut and outlast a historical Japanese sword on any bench test you care to run, and it will do it on every blade instead of 1 in 5. The old smith's achievement was never that he beat that. It was that he got as far as he got with rotten iron, a clay furnace, and his eyes. An earlier video on this channel argued that the sword was never really the decisive weapon on the battlefield, that the spear did the killing, and the sword mostly won memory and status. That still stands. This is a different question. It is not whether the sword won wars. It is how a handful of them were made, and why that making is so hard to get back. Which pulls the two threads together and lands on the thing that genuinely challenges a modern engineer. It is not the sword. Hand a good metallurgist a furnace and a budget, and she will hand you back a better blade than any king ever owned by lunch. The challenge is the knowledge. Twice over, in two cultures that never compared notes, Smiths reached an internal structure so precise that unpicking it took electron microscopes, controlled experiments, and years of a modern scientist's life. And they reached it with no theory at all, purely by feel, purely by inheritance. And here's the part that should sit a little uneasily with you. Because that knowledge lived in hands and habits instead of on paper, it was fragile in a way a modern process is not. Watch how the Wootz story actually ends, because it is quieter than the legend and, I think, more sobering for it. There was no final master who died clutching a secret. Across the 18th and 19th centuries, the trade simply came apart. Colonial restructuring reshaped the old networks. The particular ores thinned, the economics buckled under cheap industrial steel, and one workshop after another fell silent. The historian Ananda Coomaraswamy recorded some of the last traditional crucible steel being made in Sri Lanka in the opening years of the 20th century, and then that was gone too. Historians still disagree on how to describe this. Some frame it as a secret that was lost. The reading I find more convincing is duller and sadder. Nobody decided to forget. The chain of hands that carried the knowing just stopped being handed on, link by link, until no one was left holding it. And when Verhoeven and Pendray finally rebuilt the pattern in a lab, they proved two things at once, one honest and one humbling. Honest, because they showed the pattern was never sorcery, only chemistry and control that we can now explain in full. Humbling, because what they recovered was the testable part, the microstructure, the etch, the bands. What they could not recover, because it was never written anywhere, was the rest of it. The feel of that specific bar at that specific heat. The 1,000 tiny judgments the smith made without ever knowing he was making them. We got the equations. We did not get the hands. This is not only a story about old metal, and here the past reaches straight into our own century. Around the year 2000, the United States tried to refurbish an aging warhead and discovered it had forgotten how to manufacture one of the materials inside its own weapon. The people who had made it in the 1980s had retired or moved on. The plant had been torn down, and it turned out few complete records had ever been kept. It cost years and something close to $100 million to work the process out again. By one account, the fix even came down to reintroducing a trace impurity at the right step, which should sound familiar by now. A government with unlimited budget and every modern tool lost a recipe the same way a Sri Lankan village did, and for the same underlying reason. Every technical field is full of these. Processes that work beautifully and were never fully written down, carried instead in the muscle memory of people who will eventually retire. Factories have lost the knack of making things they made a generation ago. It is comforting to assume that anything important gets written down. A blade with a river running through its steel says otherwise. So the next time you hear that some old craft has been lost, resist the little shiver of mystery and ask the plainer, harder question instead. Ask whether anyone ever actually wrote it down or whether it only ever lived in a pair of hands. That is nearly always where the real answer sits. Not in a secret somebody kept, in a silence nobody noticed.